observing a fall in interest rates at the same time as a rise in output is consistent with a shift of the aggregate supply curve, not the aggregate demand curve. So another way this could have been worded would be to say, if you see interest rates fall and output rise, that means the economy is being hit by a supply shock, but not by a demand shock. So what we see, so someone looking at data sees that the interest rate has gone down, output has gone up, and the claim of the question is that we can deduce that this was a supply shock because the other possibility that it was a demand shock is wrong. So we look at the data, we see something, and we reach a conclusion about what caused it to happen. Now this question caused all kinds of difficulties. I've seen a wide variety of answers, proving the famous adage that it's possible to be wrong in many different ways, but only right in one way. I guess the reason this question caused so much confusion was that the logic is kind of backwards compared to what you're normally given in an economics question. So in an economics question, you're normally told A, B, and C has happened. What happens to X, Y, and Z? Here, things are backwards. You're told what happens to X, Y, and Z, and you're asked to say what caused it. It's actually useful in terms of your training if you ever apply what you learn in the real world, because this is the position most economists would find themselves in, that they see the data, but they want to know, to understand what caused what's actually happening in the real world, what's happening, what shocks that the economy is facing. The student in economics, though, does the opposite exercise. They're told what the shocks are, and they're asked to analyse the implications of them. In the real world, it's usually the other way around. So this question is a little bit more close to kind of thinking that real-world economists would have to do. So we see interest rates have fallen, we see output's gone up. Does that mean the economy is facing a supply shock? For certain, or is there a possibility it could face a demand shock? The question is asserting that it must be a supply shock. It's simply not possible any kind of demand shock would have caused this to happen. So, how do we reach a conclusion about this? Well, you do well, of course, to start with the correct diagram. So, we need first, of course, as the question talks about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we would need an aggregate supply, aggregate demand diagram. For certain. Let's say P1. We need, though, the ISLM diagram as well, because the question is asking us about interest rates. And you can't see interest rates directly in this picture here, so you need the ISLM diagram as a supplement. Okay, so this is our starting point. Now, the question is really in there's two claims. One a supply shock would lead to interest rates falling and output rising. That's the first part. Second claim, a demand shock would not lead to this pattern. A demand shock could not lead to seeing interest rates fall and output rise. Whilst it's possible to give a shorter answer than what I'm going to give, I'm going to start assuming I don't know which part of the question to tackle first. So let's first look at the first part of the claim, that aggregate supply could cause this. So what type of aggregate supply shock, positive or negative, must we need? If output goes up, we need a positive one. So we have to start by saying something like aggregate supply shifts to the right. What would be the effect? Well, output rises. I guess I should say AS1 to AS2. Output rises, prices fall. So we're consistent with output rising. Then the question is, can this be consistent with interest rates falling? So what's the implication of this for IS 11? Which curve is going to shift? The LM, because the price level falls. The Keynes effect that we talked about earlier. Now, you could muddy the waters in this question by putting in the Pigot effect and other kinds of effects as well. Don't deliberately make your life difficult in the exam by complicating the question. Stick with the basics. Leave it to the examiners to make the questions more difficult. So the LM curve drawn at price level P1 will be there, and the LM curve drawn price level, the lower price level P2 will be there. So that LM curve shift is caused by the price level falling. Of course, this is just showing you the movement down the aggregate demand curve that we derived earlier. So what happens? The interest rate falls as we move down the IS curve this time. Output rises. So what do we conclude? Looks like the first part of the statement is correct. This could be the smoking gun for a supply shock. It's the evidence that we need to prove a supply shock has happened. But, of course, what we've shown is that this supply shock implies interest rates down, output up as the outcome. It doesn't follow that interest rates down and output up as an outcome implies that we have a supply shock of the converse. What you need to do is show this is the only way you can see this pattern of falling interest rates, rising output. We have to look also whether a demand shock could lead to the same observation as in this case. So what type of demand shock should I consider? What you're going to see in this question is not all demand shocks have the same effect. So suppose I was setting out to disprove this statement. Suppose I wanted to show that it was wrong. What do I have to do? I need to find a demand shock that will give me lower interest rates and higher output. What type of demand shock do you think would have that effect? what type of demand shock should I go for? You've got things like confidence, that was mentioned before, so that will affect consumption and investment, which will work through the IS curve. We've got fiscal policy, also works through the IS curve. We've just though spent a question on how the central bank, through monetary policy, can affect the aggregate demand curve. So maybe monetary policy should be considered as a shock. Which one would you be tempted to try first? A monetary expansion. That is a good idea. So how would a monetary expansion work? We know that will shift aggregate demand to the right. So this is the money supply going up. Output would rise. That's good because we need it to be consistent with the empirical evidence, what we're seeing. Question is it consistent with interest rates falling? So how should I do the analysis in the ISLM diagram? Increased money supply will do what? It will move the LM curve to the right. That will move us down the IS curve. So interest rates will fall, and output will rise. So this is consistent with the evidence. Now this LM curve to begin with was drawn for money supply M1, price P1. The second LM curve was drawn for money supply M2, more money, and a higher price level P2 that we see in the left. But you know that in this case, because output rises, it must be the case that M rises by more than P. So even though the price level increases, monetary policy is still affected in this case because the aggregate supply curve is not vertical. So we get this rightward shift in LN, we move down IS, and we see that interest rates fall at the same time output rises. So we have shown the statement is false, so we provided an example of a demand shock that has the same implications for interest rates and output. The most common mistake in answering this question was to interpret a change in interest rates or a change in output as a shock itself. I shouldn't need to say this, but remember in ISLM, in ADAS, variables like interest rates, output, prices, these are endogenous variables. These are the outcomes. These are not exogenous shocks. You cannot shift the AD or AS curve because interest rates change, or because prices change, or because output change. You need something that's not on the axes of the diagrams you're using in order to shift these curves. That's true here, it's true in all cases in economics we consider. You can't shift AD or AS because prices change. That's a movement along the curve, not a shift. Okay, let's take a break. If you want something to think about during the break, you might wonder why it had to be a monetary shock and not another type of demand shock to this place. So let's resume at just after 11:30.